but none of these projects, 194, ever comes anywhere near realization, and none of the three superstates ever gains a significant lead on the others. What is more remarkable is that all three powers already possess, in the atomic bomb, a weapon far more powerful than any that their present researchers are likely to discover. Although the party, according to its habit, claims the invention for itself, atomic bombs first appeared as early as the 1940s and were first used on a large scale about 10 years later. At that time, some hundreds of bombs were dropped on industrial centers, chiefly in European Russia, Western Europe, and North America. The effect was to convince the ruling groups of all countries that a few more atomic bombs would mean the end of organized society, and hence of their own power. Top of 95. Thereafter, although no formal agreement was ever made or hinted at, no more bombs were dropped. All three powers merely continue to produce atomic bombs and store them up against the decisive opportunity which they all believe will come sooner or later. And meanwhile, the art of war has remained almost stationary for 30 or 40 years. Helicopters are more used than they were formerly. Bombing planes have been largely superseded by self-propelled projectiles, and the fragile, movable battleship has given way to the almost unsinkable floating fortress. But otherwise, there has been little development. The tank, the submarine, the torpedo, the machine gun, even the rifle and the hand grenade are still in use. And in spite of the endless slaughters reported in the press and on the telescreens, the desperate battles of earlier wars in which thousands or even millions of men were often killed in a few weeks have never been repeated. None of the three superstates ever attempts any maneuver which involves the risk of serious defeat. When any large operation is undertaken, it is usually a surprise attack against an ally. The strategy that all three powers are following or pretend to themselves that they are following is the same. The plan is, by a combination of fighting, bargaining, and well-timed strokes of treachery, to acquire a ring of bases completely encircling one or other of the rival states, and then to sign a pact of friendship with that rival and remain on peaceful terms for so many years as to lull suspicion to sleep. Completely encircle, remain peaceful terms for so many years as to lull suspicion. During this time, rockets loaded with atomic bombs can be assembled at all the strategic spots. Finally, they will all be fired simultaneously with effects so devastating as to make retaliation impossible. It will then be time to sign a pact of friendship with the remaining world power in preparation for another attack. This scheme, it is hardly necessary to say, is a mere daydream, impossible of realization. Moreover, no fighting ever occurs except in the disputed areas around the equator and the pole. No invasion of top of 96, 196. No invasion of enemy territory is ever undertaken. This explains the fact that in some places the frontiers between the superstates are arbitrary. Eurasia, for example, could easily conquer the British Isles, which are geographically part of Europe, or on the other hand, it would be possible for Oceania to push its frontiers to the Rhine or even to the Vistula, but this would violate the principle followed on all sides through never formulated of cultural integrity. If Oceania were to conquer the areas it used once to be known as France and Germany, it would be necessary either to exterminate the inhabitants, a task of great physical difficulty, or to assimilate a population of about 100 million people who, so far as technical development goes, are roughly on the oceanic level. The problem is the same for all three superstates. It's absolutely necessary to their structure that there should be no contact with foreigners except to a limited extent with war prisoners and colored slaves. Even the official ally of the moment is always regarded with the darkest suspicion. War prisoners apart, the average citizen of Oceania never sets eyes on a citizen of either Eurasia or East Asia, and he is forbidden the knowledge of foreign languages. If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself, and that most of what he has been told about them is lies. The sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his morale depends might evaporate. It is therefore realized on all sides that however often Persia or Egypt or Java or Ceylon may change hands, the main frontiers must never be crossed by anything except bombs. Yeah, please highlight that little spot there because I'm going to want to be able to find this page. Yeah, you can't. The Dirt War. Besides watching executions of war prisoners, they don't know, talk to, or it's illegal to know their language.
What are they gonna do? Like read your mind and be like, "Uh oh, you know a word that isn't our language." They don't read the mind if it's just kind of like it's kind of like the Red Scare, where if they have any indication that they think you're a communist / a thought criminal, they can just be like, "You're a communist / a thought criminal," and then you'll get arrested in November.
Think of George W. Bush and how after 9/11 we demonized Muslims and the whole entire religion of Islam
and all Arabs in general.
Yeah. Even though not all of them were...
And then the next Republican president banned Muslim air travel into this country. For what reason?
No.
For what fact?
On God. For what fact?
It was purely spiteful.
Unbased spite, too.
And unconstitutional.
Well, do you think we care about the Constitution? Like, why would we?
It's like saying, oh, bats gave us COVID, let's kill every single bat.
Yeah!
Under this bottom 196, under this lies, a fact never mentioned aloud but tacitly understood and acted upon, namely that the conditions of life in all three superstates are very much the same. In Oceania, the prevailing philosophy is called Ingsoc. In Eurasia, it's called Neo-Bolshevism. Sounds a lot like Bolsheviks. Neo-Bolshevism. And in East Asia, it's called by a Chinese name, usually translated as death worship, but perhaps better rendered as obliteration of the self. The citizen of Oceania is not allowed to know anything of the tenets of the other two philosophies, but he is taught to execrate them as barbarous outrages upon morality and common sense. Actually, the three philosophies are barely distinguishable, and the social systems which they support are not distinguishable at all. Everywhere there is the same pyramidal structure, the same worship of semi-divine leader, the leader worship on the board up here. Divine leader, the same economy existing by and for continuous warfare. It follows that the three superstates not only cannot conquer one another, but would gain no advantage by doing so. On the contrary, so long as they remain in conflict, they prop one another up like three sheaves of corn, and as usual, the ruling groups of all three powers are simultaneously aware and unaware of what they are doing. Their lives are dedicated to world conquest, but they also know that it is necessary that the war should continue everlastingly and without victory. Meanwhile, the fact that there is no danger of conquest makes possible the denial of reality, which is the special feature of Ingsoc and its rival systems of thought. Here, it's necessary to repeat what has been said earlier, that by becoming continuous war has fundamentally changed its character. So think of what Winston is learning right now. This is all new stuff to Winston. He's like, he was... Earlier in the book, he was like high-fiving because they had 100 Eurasian prisoners were getting paraded down, and I hate them, yeah, woo! And then now he's reading about how it's all fake and phony.
Well, maybe if he was smarter, he would have figured that out sooner. That's my thought on it.
In past ages, a war almost by definition was something that sooner or later came to an end, usually an unmistakable victory or defeat. In the past, also, war was one of the main instruments by which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. All rulers of all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers. Man, we were about to get a heavy dose of that, boy. But they could not attend to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency. So long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable, the precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5. But when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, top of 198. And the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. Moreover, to be efficient, it was necessary to be able to learn from the past, which meant having a fairly accurate idea of what had happened in the past. God, what a great sentence. Newspapers and history books were, of course, always colored and biased, but falsification of the kind that is practiced today. Write this page down. This is going to be a really good couple pages to be quoting in your essay next week.
Okay, what?
98. 198.
97, 98. Falsification of that kind as practiced today would have been impossible. War was a sure safeguard of sanity, and so far as the ruling classes were concerned, it was probably the most important of all safeguards. While wars could be won or lost, no ruling class could be completely irresponsible. But when war becomes literally continuous, it also ceases to be dangerous. When war is continuous, there's no such thing as military necessity. Technical progress can cease, and the most palpable facts can be denied or disregarded. As we have seen, researchers that could be called scientific are still carried out for the purposes of war, but they are essentially a kind of daydreaming, and their failure to show results is not important. Efficiency, even military efficiency, is no longer needed. Nothing is efficient in Oceania except the thought police. Since each of the 3 superstates is unconquerable, each is in effect a separate universe within which almost any perversion of thought can be safely practiced. Reality only exerts its pressure through the needs of everyday life. The need to eat and drink, to get shelter and clothing, to avoid swallowing poison or stepping out of top-story windows, and the like. Between life and death and between physical pleasure and physical pain, there is still a distinction, but that is all. Cut off from contact with the outer world and with the past, the citizen of Oceania is like a man in interstellar space who has no way of knowing which direction is up and which is down. The rulers of such a state are absolute, as the pharaohs or the Caesars could not be. They are obliged to prevent their followers from starving to death in numbers large enough to be inconvenient, and they are obliged to remain in the same low level of military technique as their rivals. But once that minimum is achieved, they can twist reality into whatever shape they choose.
First it interstellar. Breach system.
Cut off from contact. Please be helping me. The war, therefore, if we judge it by the standards of previous wars, top of 199, is merely an imposture. It's like the battles between certain ruminant animals whose horns are set at such an angle that they are incapable of hurting one another. Think longhorn sheep, rams. But though it is unreal, it is not meaningless. It eats up the surplus of consumable goods, and it helps to preserve the special mental atmosphere that a hierarchical society needs. War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair. In the past, the ruling groups of all countries, although they might recognize their common interest and therefore limit the destructiveness of war, did fight against one another, and the victor always plundered the vanquished. In our own day, they are not fighting against one another at all. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of the war is not to make or prevent conquests of territory, but to keep the structure of society intact.
Tigan, I'm a genius. That's literally what I wrote down. Yes.
Yeah. Prescient. Like, you read the future. The very word war, therefore, has become misleading. It would probably be accurate to say that by becoming continuous war has ceased to exist. The peculiar pressure that it exerted on human beings between the Neolithic, newer history age, and the early 20th century has disappeared and has been replaced by something quite different. When you see the word Neolithic, just think like people no longer live in caves and carry clubs around. has disappeared and has been replaced with something quite different. The effect would be much the same if the three superstates, instead of fighting one another, should agree to live in perpetual peace, each inviolate within its own boundaries. For in that case, each would still be a self-contained universe, freed forever from the sobering influence of external danger. A peace that was truly permanent would be the same as a permanent war. This, although the vast majority of party members understand it only in a shallower sense, is the inner meaning of the party slogan, "War is peace." Winston stopped reading for a moment. Somewhere in remote distance, a rocket bomb thundered. The blissful feeling, top of 200, of being alone with the forbidden book in a room with no telescreen had not worn off. Solitude and freedom. Dig your initials into the cell wall with your fingernail.
Tigan, you need to get that tattooed with how much you say it.
Solitude and safety were physical sensations, 200, mixed up somehow with the tiredness of his body, the softness of the chair, the touch of the faint breeze from the window that played upon his cheek. The book fascinated him, or more exactly, it reassured him. In a sense, it told him nothing that was new, but that, oh, here we go. But that was part of the attraction. It said that what he would have said, if it had been possible for him to set his scattered thoughts in order. It was the product of a mind similar to his own, but enormously more powerful, more systematic, less fear-ridden. The best books, he perceived, are those that tell you what you know already. What?
Yeah.
He had just turned back to chapter 1 when he heard Julia's footsteps on the stair and started out of his chair to meet her. She dumped her brown tool bag on the floor and flung herself into his arms. Aww. It was more than a week since they had seen one another. "I've got the book," he said as they disentangled themselves. "Oh, you've got it? Good," she said without much interest, and almost immediately knelt down beside the oil stove to make the coffee. They did not return to the subject until they had been in bed for half an hour. The evening was just cool enough to make it worthwhile to pull up the counterpane from below a window. From below came the familiar sound of singing and the scrape of boots on the flagstones. The brawny, red-armed woman whom Winston had seen there on his first visit was almost a fixture in the yard. There seemed to be no hour of daylight when she was not marching to and fro between the washtub and the line, alternately gagging herself with clothes pegs and breaking forth into lusty song. Julia had settled down on her side and seemed to be already on the point of falling asleep. He reached out for the book, which was lying on the floor, and sat up against the bed head. "We must read it," he said. "You too. All members of the Brotherhood have to read it." "You read it," she said with her eyes shut. "Read it aloud. That's the best way. Then you can explain it to me as you go." The clock's hands said 6, meaning 18. They had 3 or 4 hours ahead of them. He propped the book against his knees and began reading. Chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. Throughout recorded time, probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been 3 kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their attitude toward one another, have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as the gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. "Julia, are you awake?" "Yes, my love. I'm listening. Go on. It's marvelous," he continued reading. "The aims of these 3 groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low, that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle, top of 202, which is the same as its main outlines, recurs over and over again. For long periods, the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacities to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective," so he's really just describing political parties.
Oh yeah.
As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrust the low back into their old position of servitude and themselves become the high. Presently, a new middle group splits off from one of the other groups or from both of them, and the struggle begins over again. Of the three groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there has been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is physically better off than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no suffering of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. By the late 19th century, the recurrence of this pattern had become obvious to many observers. There then arose schools of thinkers who interpreted history as a cyclical process and claimed to show that inequality was the unalterable law of human life. This doctrine, of course, had always had its adherents, but in the manner in which it was now put forward, there was a significant change. In the past, the need for a hierarchical form of a society had been the doctrine specifically of the high. It had been preached by kings and aristocrats and by the priests, lawyers, and the like, who were parasitical upon them, and it had generally been softened by promises of compensation in an imaginary world beyond the grave. Just do this and you'll go to heaven. The middle, so long as it was struggling for power, had always made use of such terms as freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, however, top of 203, the concept of human brotherhood began to be assailed by people who were not yet in positions of command. I call out page numbers not for YouTube, but for you. But merely hope to be so before long. In the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality and then had established a fresh tier. Black Lives Matter. Anybody? The Women's March. Anybody? Under the banner of equality. And then had established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. The new middle groups, in effect, proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, old times, was still deeply infected by the utopianism of past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 onwards, the aim of establishing liberty, freedom, and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements which appeared in the middle years of the century, Ingsoc in Oceania, New Bolshevism in Eurasia, and death worship in East Asia, as is commonly called in East Asia, had the conscious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. These new movements, of course, grew out of the old ones and tended to keep their names and pay lip service to their ideology. But the purpose of all of them was to arrest progress and freeze history at a chosen moment. The familiar pendulum swing was to happen once more and then stop. As usual, the high were to be turned out by the middle, who would then become the high. But this time, by conscious strategy, the high would be able to maintain their position permanently. The new doctrines arose partly because of the accumulation of historical knowledge and the growth of the historical sense, which had hardly existed before the 19th century. The cyclical movement of history was now intelligible, or appeared to be so, and if it was intelligible, then it was alterable. This is juicy.
That's what I just said.
Really?
Yeah, I just told Abby it's the best part of the book.
I was telling you for like the first 70 pages that there's like hardly any Easter eggs, and they're like every paragraph now. But the principal underlying cause was that as early as the beginning of the 20th century, human equality had become technically possible. It was still true that men were not equal in their top of 204 native talents, and that functions had to be specialized in ways that favored some individuals against others, but there was no longer any real need for class distinctions or for large differences in wealth. Think about that. We could so easily be in the wealthiest country in the world, have
Good.
zero healthcare costs, zero poor people, zero homeless. We spend $1 trillion a year on military.
Yep.
We're not in a war.
And we're still in debt because of the military. And we probably
Why are we
always
spending
will be.
$1 trillion for military?
And we're still
Because it's fun and we want
The
brownie rights.
military-industrial complex. The military impacts every district in America on purpose.
and all of these politicians are still telling all of the people that don't worry, we're still the richest, we're still doing just fine.
But
There's nothing
grandma
wrong
can't get a
with
social
economics
security
and stuff like
check. I mean, that's
Yeah.
way too expensive. Or Johnny in 2nd grade shouldn't get his $20 EBT SNAP card.
Or grandma has to
A
leave her
month?
house.
We can't afford that a month?
Your kindergartners have $100 in lunch fees,
Oh my goodness.
like school lunch.
And when you look at like our like quote unquote like rival countries like China too, it's like they're spending half as much on their military as us, and they're easily rivaling our military too. So it's like, where is that $1 trillion going?
Mars.
It is.
Yeah, literally.
The worst part is
The worst part
that's
is
exactly where
And because they're also richer than us because of that, because they're spending, they have socialized healthcare, they have this and that, and they're spending half as much on their militaries.
And it's just going to continue because we're just numbing ourselves with our devices and don't pay attention. No one reads anymore.
Fun fact, peaceful protest is the states being like, wait, you can't be mean to me because then people will actually see that there needs to be a change made. You
Yeah.
just have to sit there and do nothing while we arrest you for it. So, you should.
By the way, in case you're wondering, socialism has become a bad word, but you need to know that most of the world's governments are socialist.
So it's a bad word so we can say it in your class.
No, it's been propagandized by one of our political parties to be a bad word. It's started with Reagan.
Oh no.
And you know what? A lot of the capitalist people that point out why communism is bad, they point out the reasons that our